Hey dudes, tonight we're heading into the sands, not just to see pyramids or mummies, but to meet the people at the very top, the Pharaohs. They ruled with absolute power. They wore gold, demanded worship, and were buried with treasure meant to last for eternity. But the truth? Their lives were anything but peaceful. Every moment was a performance, every breath watched by priests, advisors, and spies. They were called gods, but lived trapped in fear of betrayal, curses, and the afterlife they spent their whole lives preparing for and dreading. So if you're in bed, pull the blanket up a little higher, let the outside world go quiet, and join me as we walk through silent temples, hidden chambers, and the deeply lonely, disturbing life of Egypt's most powerful and most haunted rulers. The sun rises over the Nile, casting a golden hue on the sprawling land of Egypt. But for the pharaoh, waking up each day is more than just a routine. It's a ritual steeped in power, responsibility, and, unbeknownst to most, hidden dangers. From the moment he opens his eyes, the pharaoh is surrounded by more than just luxury. He lives in a world constantly at risk, plagued by assassination attempts, political maneuvering, and the relentless pressures of ruling an empire. The Pharaohs' palace, a sprawling monument of stone, is as beautiful as it is treacherous. Within these walls, servants, advisors, and enemies are all around. No one is truly trustworthy, and every word spoken in the palace is weighed with suspicion. Pharaoh's personal bodyguards stand at attention, not only to protect him from external threats, but also to guard him from internal betrayals. Pharaoh's day begins with rituals of purification, where his priests cleanse him of spiritual impurities. While many may think of a ruler's life as one of grandeur, this constant need for cleansing was more than just ceremonial. It was a shield against curses, poisonings, and other forms of sabotage that could easily end a king's reign. The palace itself was designed not just for comfort, but for protection. Hidden chambers, trapdoors, and secret passageways allowed the pharaoh to move undetected if needed. These security measures weren't just for show, they were a necessary part of the pharaoh's survival. Yet, for all the splendor of the royal life, danger lurked in every corner. Pharaoh was the target of conspiracies and plots by those closest to him. His own family, his trusted advisors, and the ever-present foreign enemies who sought to weaken Egypt. For a ruler like Pharaoh, trust was a commodity more valuable than gold, yet often just as easily tarnished. By mid-morning, the pharaoh would meet with his council, a group of officials who handled various aspects of the kingdom's administration. These meetings, though seemingly routine, were fraught with tension. Pharaoh's decisions had far-reaching consequences, and each day brought new challenges, be it a famine threatening the land, a rebellion stirring in the countryside, or a diplomatic crisis with neighboring kingdoms. As the day progresses, Pharaoh's life seems like a never-ending series of high-stakes decisions. Every move is scrutinized, every word counted as his kingdom watches, waiting for signs of weakness. Yet, despite the opulence of his existence, the pharaoh was a man like any other, frail, vulnerable, and just as susceptible to the forces of fate as his subjects. But what was it like to live under such constant threat? How did Pharaoh balance his personal safety with the overwhelming responsibility of ruling an empire? And what would happen if he failed? Pharaoh's life was one of constant surveillance, not just by his bodyguards, but by those closest to him. It was said that the walls had ears and the floors had eyes. Every move was watched, every conversation overheard. The palace, while a symbol of ultimate power, was also a prison for Pharaoh. He was a ruler, yes, but he was never truly free. The greatest threat to Pharaoh didn't always come from foreign invaders or armies, but from within his own court. Court politics, rivalries, and power struggles were a constant feature of royal life. Pharaoh's closest allies were often the most dangerous of all, and betrayal lurked in the shadows, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Take the story of Pharaoh Ramesses III, for example. Behind his throne, a plot was brewing, one that would change the course of his reign. His own wife, T, conspired with others in the palace to assassinate him, hoping her son would take the throne. This conspiracy, which was eventually uncovered, wasn't unique. Pharaohs throughout history faced similar threats, where loyalty was a currency that could be bought and sold. But it wasn't just personal betrayal that loomed over the pharaoh's head. The kingdom itself, vast as it was fragile. Egypt's immense wealth made it a prime target for invaders, while its internal structures were always at risk of collapse due to corruption or mismanagement. Pharaohs often found themselves trying to appease foreign powers, from the Hittites to the Nubians, while also suppressing uprisings within their own land. One of the most dangerous aspects of royal life was the constant pressure to maintain the appearance of invulnerability. Pharaohs were seen as living gods, embodiments of divine power on earth. To show any weakness, to even hint at fear, could lead to a loss of respect, and ultimately, a loss of power. Thus, Pharaoh had to wear a mask, not just to protect himself from those who sought to destroy him, but to keep the faith of his people. At night, the dangers didn't dissipate. The pharaoh's sleep was often disturbed by the thoughts of what awaited him the next day. Would another plot be uncovered? Would the priests report a bad omen? Would the foreign armies make their move? And, perhaps most haunting of all, would the pharaoh wake up the next morning, or would he become the next victim of palace intrigue? And yet, despite all these threats, pharaohs rarely left the palace unguarded. They were surrounded by guards and trusted servants. But even these individuals had their motives. Was the guard truly loyal, or had they been bought off by a rival faction? Even the very people sworn to protect Pharaoh could be the ones to end his reign. This web of loyalty, power, and secrecy was a constant strain. The pharaoh's success depended on how well he navigated this treacherous environment, and for many, the cost of power was too high. Those who could not manage these dangers often fell, either assassinated or imprisoned in their own palaces, forgotten by history. As night fell over Egypt, the pharaoh's life, though shrouded in mystery, became even more uncertain. With power came isolation, and with isolation, fear. The walls of the palace seemed to grow taller, the corridors longer, as Pharaoh lived under the crushing weight of responsibility. He was not just a ruler, he was the embodiment of Egypt itself. To fail was not just to lose his throne, it was to risk the collapse of an empire that had stood for millennia. Even in his most private moments, Pharaoh was never truly alone. His servants, his guards, his priests, all were watching, calculating. In ancient Egypt, the line between servant and spy was often blurred. The pharaoh's closest allies might be those who were most willing to betray him when the time came. History was full of instances where loyal advisors were paid with gold for information leading to the downfall of the very men who trusted them. But for all the intrigue, pharaohs understood the value of the unseen, the unspoken. The power of Egypt rested not just in military might, but in the divine image Pharaoh projected to the people. The Pharaoh was the intermediary between the gods and humanity, a role that was both a blessing and a curse. The people depended on their ruler for order, for prosperity, for the floods of the Nile that guaranteed a good harvest. If Pharaoh were to fall, so too would Egypt's stability. In the quiet moments of reflection, Pharaoh might have wondered, what does it mean to truly rule? Was he just a puppet of fate, forced to dance to the whims of those who would betray him? Or did he hold power over his own destiny? The constant struggle for survival, the pressure to maintain order, the knowledge that even his family might conspire against him. All of this took its toll. Pharaoh's life was a constant balancing act, a delicate dance between maintaining his divine status and facing the realities of a kingdom on the edge. Even the most powerful pharaohs could not escape the forces of time. The years of living under constant threat, surrounded by betrayal, and burdened by the weight of an empire, wore them down. Many pharaohs ruled for decades, but even the longest reigns had their limits. The mind and body of a ruler were not built to withstand the constant stress. And when the day came for Pharaoh to die, whether from age, disease, or the assassin's blade, Egypt would mourn, but it would move on. New pharaohs would rise, each facing the same dangers, each walking the same tightrope of power and peril. Yet, the greatest danger of all lay in the pharaoh's legacy. History would either remember them as great rulers, gods on earth, or they would fade into obscurity, forgotten by time. The tombs of the pharaohs, built to preserve their memory and ensure their immortality, often became their final prison. In the dark corners of Egypt, the great pyramids and burial chambers stood silent, echoing with the stories of rulers who had fallen, not by the sword, but by the silent forces of betrayal and time. The pharaoh's end, whether violent or peaceful, always raised the same questions. What did it truly mean to rule? Was the price of power worth the toll it took on the soul? And in the end, could the pharaoh ever escape the shadows of the very power he sought to wield? The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stands as an enduring symbol of Egypt's power, mysticism, and ambition. But what lies behind this monumental structure is a tale of suffering, endurance, and an overwhelming drive to achieve immortality. The pharaohs, in their quest to ascend to the afterlife, commissioned the most awe-inspiring tombs that would defy time and defy death itself. Building the Great Pyramid was no simple feat. The pharaoh who decided to undertake such a project, Khufu, also known as Cheops, believed that this monumental tomb would secure his place among the gods. The pyramid was not just a structure, it was the vessel that would carry his soul to the afterlife. But the construction of this marvel came at an unimaginable cost, one that most of the ancient world would never fully understand. The workers who labored to build the pyramid were not slaves, as often portrayed, but skilled laborers who worked in large teams, enduring the brutal conditions of the desert. The work was grueling and took decades to complete. The stone blocks that made up the pyramid, some weighing several tons, were transported from quarries across the land, often dragged by teams of men and oxen. Every step in this process was filled with pain and exhaustion, and the workers had no choice but to continue, driven by a sense of duty to their pharaoh and their gods. Each day, workers would rise before dawn to begin the relentless task of cutting, shaping, and hauling massive stone blocks. The heat of the sun would become unbearable, and the dust of the desert would suffocate every breath they took. Yet, despite the toll, the workers continued, knowing that their labor would ensure the pharaoh's place in eternity. The laborers worked in teams, each assigned to different tasks. Some would carve the stones, while others would transport them across the sands. The sheer scale of the operation required an immense workforce, and estimates suggest that tens of thousands of workers were involved, with some estimates even suggesting the number was over 100,000. The work was so intense that it has been said that many workers died during the construction process, succumbing to exhaustion, injury, or even the harsh desert conditions. Their bodies, often unrecorded in history, were lost to time. Only their labor remains. As the pyramids slowly rose, it became a symbol of Pharaoh's power and divine rule. Yet, even as Khufu's pyramid reached toward the heavens, the workers knew little of the true purpose of the project. They were mere cogs in a vast machine, working tirelessly in the blistering sun, hoping their efforts would be enough to honor their king. For the pharaoh, the pyramid was both a tomb and a temple, a place where his soul could be preserved forever. But what did it cost? The workers who toiled under the weight of this massive undertaking were not just laboring to build a tomb, they were giving their lives to the pharaoh's immortality, and for them, the pyramid represented something far more complex than just the promise of eternal glory. It symbolized the lives lost in pursuit of a dream of power and eternal life that would ultimately be realized only by the pharaoh himself. As the years passed and the Great Pyramid grew taller, its impact stretched far beyond the workers and the pharaoh himself. This massive structure, built to honor a ruler, would be a testament to the grandeur of Egypt, a nation that prided itself on eternal life through monumental achievements. Yet behind its gleaming facade lay a cost few ever considered. The labor force, tirelessly toiling to meet the pharaoh's demands, paid an enormous price. The workers, many of whom lived in small villages near the construction site, were far from the privileged elite of Egypt. They were, for the most part, farmers who had been recruited to work for the pharaoh during the off-season of their agricultural duties. Though their lives may have seemed mundane compared to the splendor of the royal court, the work they did would change the course of history. Each morning, the workers rose with the sun, their bodies stiff from the previous day's work, knowing that another day of back-breaking labor awaited them. The majority of the laborers were unskilled in stone cutting and construction, and their work was not only physically exhausting, but also dangerous. The heavy stone blocks, which were often more than 10 feet long, had to be carefully cut and transported, sometimes on makeshift wooden sleds, over miles of rugged terrain. But the true dangers of the project lay in the way the workers were treated. Pharaoh's officials demanded that the workers produce at an ever-increasing rate, pushing them to their limits. Those who were injured were often left behind, too weak to continue the grueling work. Some sources suggest that the pharaohs took extreme measures to ensure the speed of construction, using punishment and threats as motivation to keep the workers in line. There were rumors of workers being forced to work through injuries, knowing that to stop meant death. Not at the hands of an enemy, but by the cruelty of the project itself. In some respects, the pyramid became a silent killer. The toll it took on the workers was immense, yet it went largely unrecorded. While the pharaoh's name and deeds were etched into the very stone of the monument, the names of those who built it disappeared, lost to the sands of time. No one knew their stories. No one knew their suffering. The workers did not build the pyramid for themselves, but for a pharaoh who would never personally thank them. They built it for a ruler whose afterlife would be celebrated, while theirs would remain forgotten. It is hard to fathom how long-lasting the effects of such a monumental task were. By the time the pyramid was completed, many of the workers had already died, their bodies buried in unmarked graves near the construction site. As they spent years building a structure that symbolized eternity, they themselves were left to fade into history, their lives reduced to nothing more than anonymous labor, and yet their contribution is undeniable. Without them, the pyramid would have remained just a dream in the pharaoh's mind. But even as the final stone was placed, and the Great Pyramid stood proudly as a symbol of Egypt's power, the cost of its construction became ever more apparent. Pharaoh Khufu, for all his glory, never truly knew the extent of what his ambition had demanded. As his reign continued, Egypt's resources were depleted, and the heavy burden of such a grand project placed enormous strain on the empire. For a time, the pyramid was celebrated, but slowly it became a reminder of the pain and suffering that had gone into its creation. In the end, the Great Pyramid did not just represent Khufu's immortality, it symbolized the harsh reality of what it took to achieve greatness. And though the pharaoh's name has been passed down through the ages, the faces of the workers, the ones who truly made his legacy possible, remain hidden in the dust. They are the forgotten ones, whose sacrifice allowed Khufu's name to live forever. When the Great Pyramid was completed, it stood as the largest and most awe-inspiring structure ever built by human hands. But for those who had lived and died in its shadow, the monument represented more than just architectural achievement. It embodied a deeper, more complex legacy of survival, sacrifice, and a harsh truth about the nature of power and ambition. Pharaoh Khufu, who commissioned the pyramid, was not there to witness its final completion. His reign, though long, ended before the structure could be fully appreciated as a finished monument. In the end, it was a powerful symbol of the pharaoh's ambition and his desire for immortality. But it came at a steep price, not just in terms of labor, but also in the lasting effects it had on the people, the kingdom, and even the land itself. The workers who had given their blood, sweat, and tears to the construction of the pyramid had long since passed, and the records of their suffering remained largely forgotten. While Khufu's name endured for centuries, their names were never spoken. Yet the pyramid, for all its grandeur, became an eternal reminder of the imbalance between the pharaoh's power and the lives of those who served him. The pyramid stood, yes, but at what cost? The workers were gone, but their legacy, woven into every stone, every brick, lived on. The very stones that marked Khufu's eternal resting place also served as a tomb for those who had toiled under the unforgiving sun. As the centuries passed, the Great Pyramid continued to be a symbol of Egyptian glory, but it also became a silent testament to the power imbalance that existed between the pharaohs and their people. Over time, the pyramid was stripped of its outer casing, and its once glorious sheen faded under the harsh winds of the desert. Yet, despite the ravages of time, it continued to stand as a symbol of human resilience. The legacy of the workers who built it endured, though unrecognized, and their sacrifices became a story passed down through whispered tales. The pyramid, as it rose toward the sky, had represented the pharaoh's desire for immortality. But as it stood for thousands of years after its completion, it became something more, something that transcended the ambition of one ruler. It became a symbol of the resilience of the people, their ability to endure hardship, and the endurance of those who had been forgotten. The Great Pyramid outlived its creator, its builders, and even the glory of Egypt itself. But it still stood, defying the ages, a reminder that even in the most brutal of endeavors, there is something to be learned about the human spirit. Today, the pyramid stands not just as a monument to a powerful pharaoh, but as a testament to the forgotten people who lived and died beneath its shadow. Their legacy is not written in the history books, but it can be found in the very stones of the pyramid. It tells the story of a time when power was wielded without compassion, when ambition eclipsed the value of human life. But in this story, it is the workers, the unsung heroes, who endure, their efforts preserved in the very monument they helped create. In the end, the true legacy of the Great Pyramid is not just the power of the pharaoh, but the sacrifices of the countless men and women who were part of its creation. The pyramid stands not only as a tribute to a single ruler, but as a testament to the labor, the suffering, and the survival of the people whose lives were forever intertwined with its construction. In ancient Egypt, power was not solely held by the pharaohs. Beneath the glittering facade of royal wealth and military strength lay a deep, often unseen force, religion. And at the heart of this religious system were the priests. These men were not just servants of the gods. They were the gatekeepers of power, the influencers of public opinion, and the true masters behind the throne. They wielded influence over every aspect of life in Egypt, from the daily rituals to the political decisions of the pharaoh himself. The priests were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people. They held sacred knowledge, rituals, and the keys to Egypt's spiritual survival. Every pharaoh, no matter how powerful, relied heavily on the support of the priesthood to maintain his divine status. For in the eyes of the people, the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a god himself, a god who could only maintain his power through the favor and blessings of the gods. The priests were the ones who controlled access to those blessings. The life of a priest in ancient Egypt was filled with ritual, sacrifice, and strict discipline. They devoted themselves to the service of the gods, overseeing elaborate ceremonies in temples across the land. The largest and most prominent temples were dedicated to Egypt's greatest deities, Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, gods whose favor was essential to the continued prosperity of Egypt. These temples were not just places of worship, they were the centers of political, economic, and social life. They controlled vast landholdings, wealth, and even the lives of those who worked for them. Priests were highly educated, often spending years studying the sacred texts, learning the complex rituals, and mastering the language of the gods. They were also skilled in medicine, astronomy, and other sciences, as these fields were closely tied to the divine order. In a society that placed great value on knowledge and wisdom, priests held a prestigious and powerful position. But despite their revered status, the priests were not always allies of the pharaoh. While their primary role was to serve the gods, their influence often extended far beyond the temples. Priests were known to play politics, maneuvering behind the scenes to secure their power and influence in the court of the pharaoh. They understood that their fortunes were tied to the success of the pharaoh, but they also knew that their own power was built on maintaining the religious and spiritual order of the land. If a pharaoh became too weak, too unpopular, or too distant from the gods, the priests could quickly turn against him, using their influence over the people to bring about his downfall. In fact, The balance of power between pharaoh and priesthood was delicate. Many pharaohs, understanding the importance of keeping the priests in their favor, took great care to respect their authority and maintain their relationship with the temples. However, when a pharaoh overstepped his bounds or angered the priests, it could lead to rebellion and even the eventual collapse of his reign. This delicate dance between religious power and political power is one of the defining features of ancient Egyptian history. Despite their lofty status, priests were not immune to the dangerous currents of political intrigue. As the priests navigated the intricacies of religion and politics, they too faced the same dangers of betrayal, assassination, and intrigue that plagued the pharaohs. As much as they were revered for their wisdom, they were also vulnerable to the same backstabbing and manipulation that could bring down a ruler. But why did the priests wield such power? Was it simply because they controlled access to the gods? Or was there something deeper at play, something that gave them such hold over the hearts and minds of the Egyptian people? The priests of ancient Egypt were not only religious figures, they were political masterminds. They were experts in the art of manipulation, understanding better than anyone the delicate balance between the pharaoh's power and the people's devotion to the gods. It was this balance that gave the priests their extraordinary influence. While the pharaoh might command armies and control vast swathes of land, the priests held dominion over the hearts and minds of the people. They could make or break a pharaoh's rule simply by influencing the religious mood of the masses. One of the most powerful tools the priests wielded was their control over religious festivals and ceremonies. These events were not merely opportunities for worship, they were displays of power, during which the pharaoh's legitimacy was publicly reaffirmed. But the priests were the ones who decided what rituals would take place, where, and when. They were the ones who interpreted the will of the gods. If the gods were angry, the people would look to the priests for answers. And if the pharaoh failed to fulfill his divine obligations, the priests were the ones who would inform the people, often casting doubt on the pharaoh's ability to lead. This power was not always used for good. There are accounts of priests subtly manipulating religious practices to undermine pharaohs who had fallen out of favor. For example, in the reign of Akhenaten, a pharaoh known for his radical shift toward worshipping a single god, Aten, the priests of the traditional polytheistic religion felt threatened. As a result, they sought to undermine Akhenaten's reign by opposing his reforms, using their control over religious institutions to rally the people against him. In this way, the priests could even challenge the very authority of the pharaoh. But the most intriguing aspect of the priests' power was their ability to position themselves as the protectors of Egypt's future. The priests weren't just concerned with the present. They were focused on the survival of the nation, the well-being of the people, and the eternal favor of the gods. They maintained their hold on the people by continually reminding them of the importance of religion in maintaining order and prosperity. Egypt, they argued, could not survive without the divine blessing of the gods. This message resonated deeply with the people, who depended on the priests to interpret signs and omens that might foretell either divine favor or punishment. It was this message that allowed the priests to hold such sway over the pharaoh. While a pharaoh might rule with an iron fist, the priests ruled through faith. A pharaoh could have all the wealth and power in the world, but without the priest's approval, his rule would be fragile. The priests were the unseen hand, the force that could topple even the most powerful of rulers. This relationship between pharaoh and priesthood, though complicated, was essential to the survival of Egypt. The pharaoh needed the priests to maintain his divine status while the priests needed the pharaoh to enforce their religious authority. When one side failed, the other would suffer, and the consequences could be disastrous for the nation. The collapse of one dynasty often led to the rise of another, sometimes with the priests playing a central role in deciding which pharaoh would succeed. However, this game of political chess came with its risks. There were moments in Egyptian history when the priests overstepped their bounds. The most famous example of this occurred during the reign of the priest-king, the high priest of Amun, Herihor, who essentially seized power in the aftermath of the collapse of the New Kingdom. Though he claimed the title of pharaoh, his reign was essentially the result of the priest's ability to fill the power vacuum left by a weak and absent monarch. It was a telling reminder that the priests, while sometimes in the background, could seize power at a moment's notice if the conditions were right. But for all their scheming and manipulation, the priests were not immune to the ever-changing tides of power. The fall of one pharaoh meant the rise of another, and sometimes that meant the priests themselves were at risk. During the reign of Ramses III, for example, a plot known as the Harem Conspiracy was uncovered, in which members of the royal court, including high-ranking officials and priests, attempted to overthrow the pharaoh. It was another reminder that for all their religious power, the priests were just as vulnerable as any other group to the shifting allegiances and power struggles that defined ancient Egypt. The priests, however, were not solely motivated by politics. Their devotion to the gods was sincere, even if their actions sometimes betrayed their own power-hungry tendencies. They were deeply entwined in Egypt's religious life, performing sacred rituals, overseeing funerary practices, and preserving the sacred knowledge of the ancient world. But even in their devotion, they played a dangerous game, a game of power that could elevate them to the highest echelons of society or bring about their downfall. As the priests navigated the complex landscape of ancient Egyptian politics, they left behind a legacy that was both powerful and at times destructive. Their influence shaped Egypt's history, and their actions continue to echo through the ages, reminding us of the immense role religion and politics played in the ancient world. By the end of the New Kingdom, the balance between the pharaohs and the priests had begun to shift. The priests, once the undisputed power behind the throne, started to see their influence wane. As Egypt faced foreign invasions, internal strife, and the gradual erosion of its wealth and power, the once sacred bond between the religious and political powers grew weaker. The priests, who had once been the guardians of Egypt's spiritual and political stability, now found themselves in a battle for survival, as the pharaohs sought to reassert their control and limit the priests' power. The decline of priestly influence did not happen overnight. It was a slow process, marked by the increasing reliance on military power, foreign alliances, and economic reforms to maintain the stability of Egypt. Pharaohs began to distance themselves from the temples and the priesthood, realizing that their personal power, rather than the blessings of the gods, would secure their place in history. The priests, whose wealth and landholdings had made them the second most powerful force in Egypt, saw their influence erode as the pharaohs began to place more emphasis on centralized authority. One of the most significant shifts occurred during the reign of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who famously attempted to establish a monotheistic religion based on the worship of Aten, the sun disk. Akhenaten's radical reforms directly threatened the power of the traditional priesthood, particularly the powerful priests of Amun. Under Akhenaten, the priests of Amun lost their political and economic power, as temples to other gods were closed or repurposed. This marked a turning point in Egypt's religious landscape, with the pharaoh rather than the priests dictating the nation's spiritual direction. However, Akhenaten's reforms, though bold, were short-lived. His death marked the end of the religious revolution, and his successor, Tutankhamun, restored the traditional polytheistic religion, re-establishing the power of the priests. Yet, despite this restoration, the power of the priesthood would never return to its former heights. The damage had been done. The priests had been publicly humiliated, and their loss of influence was permanent. The pharaohs, having learned the dangers of relying too heavily on the religious establishment, increasingly sidelined the priesthood in favor of their own power. In the centuries that followed, the priest's role in Egypt's politics became more symbolic than practical. The temples remained, and religious rituals continued, but the priests no longer wielded the same level of authority. The pharaohs turned their attention to external threats, such as the invasions by the Sea Peoples and the decline of Egypt's military power, and internal threats, such as corruption and civil unrest. In this new age of military and economic struggles, the influence of religion, once the cornerstone of Egypt's power, had faded into the background. Yet, despite their diminished influence, the priests' legacy remained. Their role in preserving Egypt's religious and cultural traditions ensured that the nation's spiritual identity continued long after the fall of the great pharaohs. The knowledge and practices of the priesthood, though less powerful in the political arena, continued to shape the culture of Egypt, influencing art, architecture, and even the way the people viewed their relationship with the divine. As Egypt's political and religious structures evolved, the priests of the past became a symbol of an older, more divine way of thinking, one that placed faith and spirituality above earthly power. But in the end, the political and military forces that had once been so closely tied to the priests were replaced by new systems of governance, and Egypt's long reign as a world power came to an end. The fall of the priesthood in Egypt serves as a reminder of the fleeting nature of power, no matter how sacred or invincible it may seem. The priests, once the most powerful force in Egyptian society, were gradually overtaken by the very political forces they had once helped to shape. In their quest to control the hearts and minds of the people, they had forgotten one crucial thing: power, even divine power, is ultimately fleeting, and no institution is safe from the winds of change. But what does this tell us about the nature of power? Is it truly enough to rely on faith? Or does the inevitable march of time demand that we shift our focus toward other means of survival? And in the case of Egypt, what lessons can we learn from the rise and fall of such an influential and powerful institution? While the great pharaohs like Ramses II, Tutankhamun, and Khufu have cemented their names in history, many rulers have been lost to the annals of time, their legacies overshadowed by more famous predecessors. These forgotten pharaohs, though once at the helm of one of the most powerful civilizations on earth, left behind little more than the remnants of their reigns. They are remembered only by archaeologists and historians, whose work unearths the mysterious remains of rulers who had faded from the collective memory of Egypt and the world. Among these forgotten pharaohs, one of the most intriguing figures is Pharaoh Meneptah I, a ruler from the 13th dynasty. His reign was short, lasting only a few years, yet it played a crucial role in the decline of the Middle Kingdom. Very little is known about his life or accomplishments. Unlike the great pharaohs who built monuments to themselves, Meneptah I left no grand tomb or massive pyramid behind to mark his place in history. Instead, his reign was filled with political instability. a symptom of Egypt's growing internal strife during the Second Intermediate Period. Another forgotten ruler was Pharaoh Neferhotep III, a monarch of the 13th dynasty, who ruled at a time when Egypt was already beginning to lose its grip on power. His reign was marked by attempts to restore Egypt's former glory, yet little survives to document his achievements. His tomb, located at Abydos, is a mere shadow of the grand structures built by his predecessors. The wealth of Egypt was fading, and Neferhotep's efforts to stave off decline were ultimately unsuccessful. There are many such pharaohs, whose names were once known, but who have slipped into obscurity. What is it about these rulers that made them disappear from the historical record? Some historians believe that the decline of their dynasties contributed to their erasure from history. Their reigns were brief, their contributions minor, and their tombs unremarkable. They were overshadowed by the grandeur of their successors, or the grandeur of those who came before them. In the grand tapestry of Egyptian history, their threads were too thin to be noticed. Yet, the very existence of these forgotten rulers sheds light on the nature of power in ancient Egypt. Egypt's strength was often dependent not just on the ability of one pharaoh, but on the system that allowed the throne to pass from one ruler to the next. When the system faltered, when a pharaoh failed to provide for the kingdom's stability or prosperity, the results were swift and unforgiving. These forgotten pharaohs were often victims of this system, rulers who took the throne at a time when the winds of change were already blowing. Unlike their more famous counterparts, these forgotten pharaohs did not build monumental structures or undertake massive military campaigns that would ensure their names would be passed down through history. Their reigns were marked by the political and social turbulence of the times, and while they may have done their best to hold Egypt together, they were ultimately unable to overcome the forces that worked against them. The mystery of these forgotten pharaohs lies in their anonymity. Their names are barely remembered, and their achievements have been lost to time. Yet their very disappearance tells a story about the fleeting nature of power. Even the greatest rulers, no matter how powerful or influential, are subject to the forces of history. Time has a way of obscuring those who fail to leave behind something lasting. As Egypt's dynasties continued, the forgotten pharaohs left behind a legacy that was not marked by great monuments or achievements, but by the quiet whisper of their existence. These rulers were not failures by their own design, but rather victims of circumstances. Political instability, war, and the shift of power to new forces often marked their reigns. The most tragic part of their story is that their reigns are now lost to the sands of time, erased from history, overshadowed by more successful rulers whose accomplishments were enough to be carved into stone for eternity. One such pharaoh was Sobekotep IV, who reigned during the 13th dynasty at a time when Egypt was weakening. Sobekotep IV's reign is often overlooked due to the lack of monumental structures or records to commemorate his rule. What little we know of him comes from sparse inscriptions and fragmented records, and his tomb, which would have been a symbol of his power, has not survived. His reign, although important in the continuity of Egypt's Middle Kingdom, was not marked by significant military or economic triumphs, leading to his near-complete erasure from Egyptian history. Similarly, Pharaoh Amenemhat II's reign, also during the Second Intermediate Period, remains a mystery. While we know that he ruled in the mid-18th century BCE, his name appears only occasionally in records that have largely been lost. There are no grand monuments to his memory, and even the location of his tomb remains uncertain. His reign exists only as a footnote in the long history of Egypt's pharaohs, barely leaving a trace of its existence. The mystery of these pharaohs is not just their forgotten legacies, but also the implications their reigns had on the broader Egyptian story. Their struggles reflected the challenges Egypt faced in the later stages of the Middle Kingdom and the onset of the Second Intermediate Period. The pharaohs who followed them were often faced with instability, civil war, and the growing pressure from foreign invaders. Egypt's decline during this time meant that many pharaohs, even those who might have tried to restore Egypt's glory, became nothing more than brief, inconsequential figures in the eyes of history. The forgotten pharaohs were often the product of dynasties in turmoil, where each ruler faced pressures that would eventually overwhelm them. Their reigns were often short, and their successors were already planning to consolidate power in a way that erased the previous ruler's memory. Egypt's power was fractured, and as the central authority weakened, even those with the best intentions were left unable to leave their mark. They were like faint stars in the vast Egyptian night, shining briefly before fading into the darkness of time. The story of these pharaohs is a somber reminder of the impermanence of power. Even the most powerful rulers could be forgotten, their names swallowed up by time, leaving behind only traces of their existence in ancient inscriptions or obscure references. It was a harsh truth about the nature of history. Only those who could endure beyond their reign, those who could create something that lasted for generations, were truly remembered. The absence of these rulers in the history books raises a powerful question. What does it take to be remembered? Was it enough to rule for a time, to face the challenges of leadership? Or did one need to leave behind a monument, a grand building, or a victory that would forever anchor their name in the consciousness of history? The forgotten pharaohs did not possess these markers of greatness, and as a result, they were left behind as mere shadows of a past that was quickly forgotten. Their reigns may not have changed the course of Egypt's history, but their lives serve as a reminder of the precarious nature of power. In a kingdom as vast and enduring as Egypt, even the mightiest could be overshadowed by the very systems they sought to uphold. Their absence in the historical narrative does not lessen their importance, but rather highlights how time, history, and fate can often erase even the greatest of rulers, leaving their legacies forgotten. The stories of the forgotten pharaohs are often dismissed by history, their names fading away into obscurity. However, their disappearances speak volumes about the nature of power, legacy, and what it takes to be remembered. These pharaohs may not have left behind grand pyramids, imposing temples, or military victories, but their lives and reigns are rich with lessons that are often overlooked. One of the most important lessons these forgotten rulers teach us is the fleeting nature of power. The grandeur of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, figures like Ramses II or Thutmose III, was built on monumental achievements that ensured their names would be etched into the pages of history. But for the forgotten pharaohs, their lack of grand accomplishments or lasting monuments meant that their names would eventually fade. Their stories are a stark reminder that even the most powerful figures can be swallowed by the passage of time. Yet, this does not diminish the significance of their reigns. The forgotten pharaohs were products of their time, working within a system that often failed to provide the stability they needed to leave a lasting impact. They ruled during periods of transition, when Egypt was facing internal strife, invasions, and the slow unraveling of its power. Their reigns, while short and sometimes uneventful, were a reflection of the larger forces at play in Egypt's history. These rulers navigated political instability, dealt with external threats, and faced challenges that may have been beyond their control. Another important lesson from the forgotten pharaohs is the concept of legacy. History tends to favor those whose legacies are tangible, those who can point to massive structures, military victories, or grand reforms. However, the true nature of a ruler's legacy is not always measured by physical monuments or material wealth. A pharaoh's legacy can also be found in the small acts of governance, the ways in which they stabilized a nation, or the impact they had on their people, even if that impact was not immediately visible. The forgotten pharaohs remind us that legacy is not always about being remembered in the grandest of ways. It is about the quieter contributions, the subtle decisions that can shape the course of history in ways that might not be evident until long after a ruler's death. These pharaohs, though not remembered for their monumental achievements, still played a role in preserving Egypt's legacy as a powerful civilization. Ultimately, the story of these rulers teaches us about the impermanence of fame and the human desire for immortality. These pharaohs, in their pursuit of glory and the afterlife, sought to carve their names into eternity. Yet, they discovered a harsh truth. No ruler, no matter how powerful, is immune to the ravages of time. As Egypt's power waned, so too did the memory of those who had once held the throne. In the end, history often chooses who will be remembered and who will fade into the shadows. The forgotten pharaohs also show us the dangers of becoming too focused on the pursuit of glory. In their efforts to cement their place in history, many of them overlooked the practical needs of their people and their empire. Their reigns were often marked by political instability, short-lived achievements, and the inability to adapt to changing circumstances. These pharaohs remind us that the true measure of a ruler's success is not in the monuments they leave behind, but in how they navigate the complexities of governance, leadership, and change. In reflecting on these rulers, we are reminded of the transient nature of power and legacy, and how history ultimately judges its heroes. The forgotten pharaohs may not have achieved immortality in the way they envisioned, but their reigns still contributed to the rich tapestry of Egypt's history. They were not failures, they were simply caught in a system that often proved unforgiving. And in that, their stories hold a unique place in the chronicles of Egypt's past. As we remember these forgotten pharaohs, we are left with one final thought. What will our legacy be? Will we be remembered for grand achievements, or will we, too, fade into the shadows of time, our names lost to the ages? And perhaps more importantly, what can we learn from the pharaohs who have already been forgotten? In the end, history is not just about the grand triumphs. It is about the quieter moments that define a life, the actions that ripple through time, and the lessons we leave behind. In ancient Egypt, the process of mummification was not just a method of preserving the body. It was a sacred ritual designed to ensure immortality. The Egyptians believed that death was not an end, but a transition into another world, and that the soul would need its body to survive the journey to the afterlife. This belief was so deeply ingrained in Egyptian culture that no expense or effort was spared in preparing the deceased for this passage. Mummification, which began with the embalmers carefully removing the internal organs, was a delicate and meticulous process. The organs, which were thought to be vital for the afterlife, were preserved separately. The heart, for instance, was believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, and was carefully preserved to ensure that the deceased could use it in the afterlife. The brain, considered unnecessary by the Egyptians, was removed and discarded, while the lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines were carefully embalmed and placed in canopic jars. The body itself was then desiccated with natron, a naturally occurring salt, which dried out the flesh and prevented decay. Once the body was sufficiently dried, it was wrapped in layers of linen bandages. The embalming process could take up to 70 days, with various spells and rituals performed throughout to protect the deceased soul, known as the ka, and to ensure that it would be able to recognize its body in the afterlife. The final step was the burial, which involved placing the mummified body in a tomb filled with treasures and offerings for the deceased's journey. The tomb would often contain food, clothing, and other items the deceased might need in the afterlife, as well as figurines known as shabti, which were meant to serve the deceased in the next world. While mummification was a powerful and revered practice, it was also a costly and elaborate process that required skilled labor, precious materials, and time. For the elite and the pharaohs, mummification was a necessary part of their legacy, ensuring that their names and bodies would be preserved for eternity. However, the darker side of this process was that it was reserved for the wealthy and powerful. Ordinary Egyptians who could not afford such elaborate rituals were often buried in simpler graves with little to no mummification, leaving them to be forgotten in the sands of time. The pursuit of immortality through mummification was a defining feature of ancient Egyptian culture, but it also revealed a more unsettling aspect of their society: the stark inequality between the rulers and the ruled. While pharaohs and high-ranking officials were prepared for the afterlife with the finest materials, the common people were often left to face the harsh realities of death without the luxury of mummification. For them, the journey to the afterlife was uncertain, and their legacy would be determined by the memories of those who survived them. The process of mummification also had its own darker implications. The need for valuable materials to create the elaborate tombs and mummies led to the exploitation of resources and labor. The building of the tombs, including the construction of the pyramids, required immense human effort, much of which was carried out by the labor of slaves and conscripted workers. These workers were often subjected to grueling conditions and harsh treatment, with little regard for their well-being. In many ways, the desire for immortality came at a great cost, not just to the resources of the kingdom, but also to the lives of the people who worked to create these eternal resting places for the elite. It was a system that reinforced the power and privilege of the pharaohs and the priesthood, while leaving little for those who served them. While the mummification process itself may have been sacred, it also underscored the divide between the powerful and the powerless. For those who could afford it, the promise of immortality was a tangible reality. But for the rest, death was a far less certain fate. The gap between the afterlife of the elite and the common people highlighted the harsh realities of Egyptian society, a society built on the preservation of the pharaoh's divine legacy, but one that often left the less fortunate to face the unknown with nothing but a simple grave. The pursuit of immortality in ancient Egypt, symbolized by the intricate and costly process of mummification, was more than a spiritual endeavor. It was a practice deeply embedded in Egypt's social and economic structure, and it came with its own set of darker consequences. Mummification was not just about preserving the body for the afterlife. It was a mechanism for reinforcing social hierarchies and perpetuating the power of the pharaohs and the elite. The elite, including the pharaohs, priests, and high-ranking officials, could afford elaborate mummifications, tombs, and elaborate burial goods, These lavish preparations were designed to ensure a smooth journey to the afterlife, where the deceased would live in eternal peace among the gods. But for the majority of the population, the situation was drastically different. The common people, who worked to build the tombs and prepare the mummies of the elite, often lacked the means to afford such luxuries. They were buried in simple graves with minimal offerings, and their chances of achieving immortality were slim. This divide between the rich and the poor in life was mirrored in death, while the pharaohs and the elite were guaranteed a smooth passage to the afterlife. The commoners had little hope of such an experience. The social divide that existed during life continued into death, where the promise of immortality was not equally available to all. The cost of immortality was not only financial, but also human. The creation of the tombs and the mummification of the elite required the labor of thousands of workers. These workers were often conscripted from the lower classes and forced to work under harsh conditions. The construction of monumental tombs like those in the Valley of the Kings required immense manpower, and the laborers who were tasked with building these grand structures worked in dangerous and grueling conditions. The workers were often subjected to long hours, intense physical labor, and the constant threat of punishment for any perceived mistake or failure. The toll on the labor force was immense. Many workers died while constructing the tombs or during the embalming process. The labor force, often made up of conscripted peasants, faced harsh conditions that resulted in injuries, sickness, and death. Yet, despite the dangers, the work continued, driven by the belief that the rewards of immortality were reserved only for the privileged few. The irony of this system was that the very people who ensured the pharaoh's immortality were the ones who were most likely to be forgotten in death. Even the process of mummification itself, which was supposed to preserve the body for the afterlife, had a darker side. The materials used to embalm the body were expensive, and the process consumed valuable resources. The workers who handled the bodies were at risk of contamination from the chemicals and materials used, and the close contact with the dead could lead to illness or injury. The embalming process was an elaborate and dangerous endeavor, with workers often exposed to the harmful effects of resins, perfumes, and other substances used in the preservation process. Moreover, the sheer scale of the mummification industry placed immense strain on Egypt's resources. The demand for embalming materials, tomb construction, and burial goods drained the economy and required vast amounts of labor and materials. This demand was not only a financial burden, but also an environmental one. The excavation of quarries for stone, the collection of wood for coffins, and the procurement of precious metals for burial goods placed significant pressure on Egypt's natural resources. The obsession with immortality, then, was not without its costs. While the elite enjoyed the comforts of eternal life, the common people endured the physical and emotional toll of maintaining the grand structure of Egypt's death culture. The riches and grand monuments of the pharaohs were built on the backs of those who would never see the same benefits. The promise of eternal life came at the expense of the very people who worked to make it possible. Yet, despite these disparities, the culture of mummification endured for millennia, with pharaohs and the elite continuing to invest in elaborate tombs and burial goods as a way to guarantee their immortality. The belief in the afterlife became a cornerstone of Egyptian society, a belief that shaped not only the way people lived, but also the way they died. As Egypt's empire began to weaken and its resources dwindled, the practice of mummification became more difficult to maintain. By the time of Egypt's decline, the grand tombs and mummifications of the past were replaced by simpler burial practices. But the legacy of immortality, built on the sweat and blood of countless workers, remained a defining feature of Egypt's culture, one that continued to fascinate and intrigue historians, archaeologists, and the modern world. The irony of immortality, as seen in ancient Egypt, is that while the pharaohs sought to preserve their legacies for eternity, the very people who made this possible were left to fade into obscurity, their names lost to time. The burial practices of ancient Egypt highlight the complex interplay between power, wealth, and mortality, and the darker side of the quest for eternal life. The process of mummification, while a revered and sacred ritual in ancient Egypt, reveals the dark reality of immortality. The painstaking efforts to preserve the body for the afterlife, to secure eternal life for the pharaohs and the elite, came with a toll that extended far beyond the labor of the workers and the resources of the kingdom. The quest for immortality led to the creation of a deeply entrenched social and economic system, one that reinforced inequality and led to the exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few. At the heart of this system was the powerful desire for eternal life. The pharaohs and elite were convinced that the key to preserving their legacy lay in their tombs and their mummification. Yet this pursuit of immortality often created a cycle of exploitation. The lavish tombs, the enormous pyramids, and the wealth that accompanied a pharaoh's burial were all crafted by the labor of common workers, men and women who would never know the benefits of this immortality. The most vivid example of this paradox can be seen in the construction of the pyramids. While the pharaohs' bodies were carefully embalmed and placed within these grand structures, the workers who built them were often left to die in obscurity, buried without ceremony, their names and sacrifices lost to time. Their labor contributed to the grandeur of Egypt's most powerful rulers, but their own lives, their own legacies, were forgotten. For the pharaohs, the promise of immortality through mummification was a powerful tool for securing their place in history. But this immortality, as it turned out, was not without its costs. The practice of preserving the body for eternity created a system where the pharaohs were glorified, but the common people were left to suffer for the luxury of the elite. The very foundation of the mummification process relied on an oppressive system that gave power to the few while keeping the many in servitude. The burden of immortality, therefore, was not only felt by the workers who toiled for the pharaohs, but also by the land itself. The resources needed to create the elaborate tombs and perform the mummification rituals drained the kingdom's wealth, leaving Egypt vulnerable to internal strife and external threats. The grandeur of the pharaohs' tombs, which were meant to preserve their legacy, ultimately contributed to Egypt's decline. The immense resources required for such elaborate burials meant that the kingdom was constantly on the brink of financial collapse. The pharaohs, in their quest to secure their afterlife, may have inadvertently hastened the decline of their empire. Even after death, the pharaoh's pursuit of immortality continued to have consequences. The tombs, while designed to preserve the bodies of the rulers, were often raided by tomb robbers. These tombs, filled with treasures and offerings meant for the afterlife, became symbols of greed and exploitation. The very efforts to protect the pharaoh's immortality were undermined by the human desire for wealth and power, and the cycle of exploitation continued long after the pharaohs themselves had passed. As Egypt's power waned and the empire crumbled, the practice of mummification and the extravagant burial rites that had once been a symbol of Egypt's strength became a burden. The resources required to maintain these rituals drained Egypt's wealth, and the practice eventually became more symbolic than functional. In the end, the pharaohs' efforts to achieve immortality through their mummification were not enough to protect their empire from the forces of time and decay. The darker side of immortality is that, while the pharaohs and the elite were guaranteed eternal life in the eyes of history, the common people were left to face the unknown. They were denied the luxury of mummification, their bodies left to decay without the hope of eternal life. The workers who built the grand tombs and prepared the bodies for the afterlife were often forgotten, their names and contributions lost to time. The pursuit of immortality, while creating lasting monuments to the pharaohs, left behind a legacy of inequality, exploitation, and the inevitable passage of time. In the end, the question of immortality in ancient Egypt raises a deeper philosophical inquiry. Is the pursuit of eternal life worth the cost? For the pharaohs, the answer was undoubtedly yes. But for the many workers who suffered to create their tombs, the cost was far too high. The grand monuments to the pharaohs' immortality now stand as both a testament to their power and a reminder of the price that was paid for their eternal legacy. And while the pharaohs may have achieved immortality in the form of their tombs and mummies, the workers who made that immortality possible have faded into the shadows of history. As we reflect on the grand yet costly pursuit of immortality, we are left to consider the impact of such desires on our own society. What price are we willing to pay to leave behind a legacy? And how much are we willing to sacrifice for the sake of preserving our name for eternity? In the grand halls of the pharaoh's palace, power was not merely held by the ruler alone. It was a commodity that flowed through the corridors of the court, traded, bartered, and manipulated by a web of officials, advisors, and courtiers. The pharaoh's court was a place where political games were played daily, where alliances were forged and broken, and where the struggle for power could lead to deadly consequences. The pharaoh, as the embodiment of divine authority, was seen as the ultimate ruler of Egypt. However, his ability to govern depended not just on his strength, but also on the support of the key figures in his court. The advisors, generals, and high priests wielded significant power, often more so than any single individual in the palace. These men and women, with their own ambitions and loyalties, shaped the course of history just as much as the pharaoh himself. In Egypt, the court was often marked by constant maneuvering, as those closest to the pharaoh vied for influence and control. The highest-ranking officials were more than just bureaucrats. They were political players in a dangerous game. They understood that the pharaoh's favor could be won or lost with a simple word, and that their future could be determined by who controlled the most power behind the scenes. The pharaoh's vizier, the second most powerful figure in Egypt, was a master of this political landscape. The vizier was the chief administrator of the kingdom, overseeing everything from tax collection to military organization. In many ways, the vizier held the real power, managing the day-to-day affairs of Egypt while the pharaoh focused on matters of state and religion. A skilled vizier could steer the kingdom in any direction he chose, using his influence to secure his own wealth and power. But the vizier's power was always precarious. The pharaoh's favor could shift at a moment's notice, and a single misstep could lead to disgrace or death. The complex web of relationships within the court meant that alliances were always shifting, and loyalty was a fragile thing. Power in the pharaoh's court was constantly in flux, and one wrong move could result in a rapid fall from grace. To maintain his position, the pharaoh had to surround himself with loyalists, individuals whose loyalty was unquestionable. However, loyalty in the royal court was often more about pragmatism than devotion. The loyalty of the pharaoh's advisors was frequently tested, with rivals constantly plotting to undermine each other. These rivalries could take many forms: whispered accusations, forged documents, secret meetings, and even assassination attempts. The high priests in particular were known for playing these games, as they understood that controlling the god's favor could be the key to controlling the pharaoh. At the heart of this political intrigue was the pharaoh's family. The royal family, like the court itself, was a breeding ground for power struggles. The pharaoh's sons, daughters, and wives each sought to secure their own place in history. The competition for the throne could be fierce, with siblings and even parents scheming to put their own blood on the throne. The rivalry between pharaohs and their families was not just about wealth and power, it was a matter of survival. In some instances, the political games played within the court led to violent confrontations. The most notorious example of this occurred during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, who was the victim of a palace conspiracy orchestrated by his own harem. The plot, known as the harem conspiracy, involved members of the royal family and high-ranking officials who sought to kill Ramses III in order to place his son Pentawere on the throne. The conspiracy was uncovered, but the fact that it could take place at the very heart of the royal family illustrates the ruthless nature of the political games played in the pharaoh's court. Even though the pharaoh was a god in the eyes of the people, his court was no sanctuary from treachery. In fact, it was often the most dangerous place in all of Egypt. The stakes were incredibly high. One wrong move could result in the destruction of an entire family or dynasty. The court was a microcosm of Egypt's greater struggles for power, wealth, and survival. The political intrigue within the pharaoh's court also extended to foreign relations. Egypt was surrounded by powerful kingdoms, and alliances with foreign rulers were crucial to maintaining Egypt's dominance in the region. These alliances were often forged through marriage, diplomatic negotiations, and strategic military support. However, these foreign relations were also a source of constant tension. Diplomacy could be a mask for hidden agendas, with foreign rulers seeking to manipulate the pharaoh's court for their own gain. In this world of ever-shifting alliances and rivalries, survival required more than just strength. It required cunning, deception, and the ability to read the room. To be part of the pharaoh's court meant living in a constant state of vigilance, knowing that at any moment your enemies could strike. It was a world of power, manipulation, and deadly games, where the price of losing was often death. In the pharaoh's court, nothing was as it seemed. The power struggles that unfolded behind the palace walls were as complex as they were dangerous. Ambitious individuals, driven by their desire for wealth, influence, and control, played a dangerous game of manipulation. Alliances were formed, only to be shattered in an instant, with betrayal lurking around every corner. It was a world where loyalty was bought and sold, and the consequences of broken alliances were often deadly. The pharaoh's family was not exempt from these power plays. Sons and daughters, vying for the throne, frequently conspired against each other. A pharaoh's death could lead to a bloody battle for succession, with siblings plotting to eliminate one another. This struggle for the throne often led to the involvement of powerful court officials, generals, and even priests, who saw the changing of rulers as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. In such an environment, the stakes of political games could not have been higher. One of the most famous examples of this deadly rivalry was the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, whose radical religious reforms created significant unrest within the sub-court. Akhenaten's decision to introduce the worship of the god Aten, effectively sidelining Egypt's traditional pantheon of gods, angered many of the high-ranking priests. The pharaoh's own advisors, fearing that their influence would be diminished, sought ways to remove him from power. His wife, Nefertiti, who once held a position of prominence alongside him, found herself pushed to the sidelines as rivals moved to consolidate power. The situation grew even more complex after Akhenaten's death. His successor, the young Tutankhamun, was placed on the throne, but his reign was marred by political intrigue. The young king was guided by a council of advisors, many of whom were more concerned with their own ambitions than with the well-being of the pharaoh or the stability of Egypt. This power vacuum led to the rise of figures like A, the vizier, who maneuvered to solidify his position as the de facto ruler of Egypt. In the end, A's actions led to the decline of the royal family, and after Tutankhamun's untimely death, he assumed the throne himself. A's reign, though brief, was marked by the ruthlessness required to maintain power in a court where trust was a rare commodity. These stories of succession struggles and political maneuvering were not limited to the royal family. The high-ranking officials within the pharaoh's court were also players in this deadly game. One of the most dangerous individuals within the court was the vizier, who wielded immense power over Egypt's administration. Though the vizier's role was supposed to be one of service to the pharaoh, many sought to use their position for personal gain. Some viziers managed to manipulate the pharaoh into granting them vast wealth and control, while others used their influence to bring down rivals. The court's internal struggles often manifested in assassinations and executions. Political rivals, those suspected of disloyalty, or individuals deemed a threat to the pharaoh's rule, were swiftly dealt with. Assassination was not always a direct act of violence. It could be done through poison, sabotage, or subtle manipulations that led to a fall from grace. Once an individual fell out of favor, their position was easily usurped by someone more cunning, more willing to do what was necessary to climb the ranks of power. Perhaps one of the most infamous betrayals occurred during the reign of Ramses III, whose court became a battleground for power-hungry individuals. Ramses III's own wives and officials were involved in a conspiracy known as the Harem Conspiracy, which sought to overthrow the king and place his son on the throne. The conspiracy was exposed, and the ringleaders were executed, but the fact that such a plot could take place within the royal family speaks to the high level of intrigue and danger present in the pharaoh's court. While betrayal was common within the royal family and high officials, the priests also had a significant role in shaping the balance of power in Egypt. The priesthood was extremely powerful, controlling vast land holdings and wealth, and they often played a central role in political struggles. The pharaoh, while seen as a divine ruler, relied heavily on the priests to maintain the favor of the gods and to legitimize his reign. If the priests withdrew their support, it could mean the downfall of a pharaoh. Priests also held significant sway in foreign diplomacy. Egypt's alliances with neighboring kingdoms were often cemented through religious ceremonies, and the priests had the ability to influence which kingdoms were seen as allies or enemies. When rival priests sought to align themselves with foreign rulers, they could help orchestrate political changes within Egypt, further adding to the political volatility. This constant turmoil within the pharaoh's court highlights the fragility of power. While the pharaoh was seen as the supreme ruler, his ability to maintain control was dependent on his ability to navigate the shifting loyalties of those around him. every day was a delicate balancing act, as the pharaoh had to contend with threats from both within and outside his court. The very system that had been built to protect his rule, the court, the army, and the priesthood, was also the system that could bring about his downfall. The story of the pharaoh's court, filled with intrigue, betrayal, and deadly alliances, serves as a powerful reminder of the complexity of ruling an empire. It is not enough to simply hold the throne. One must also maintain the loyalty of those around him. And in a world where loyalty is bought and sold, this is a dangerous and precarious endeavor. As the political games and deadly alliances of the Pharaoh's court continued to unfold, the very structures that upheld Egypt's empire began to show cracks. The quest for power, control, and influence had a heavy price, one that many in the royal family and among the court's officials were unable to pay without consequence. While the pharaohs and their court enjoyed immense wealth and influence, they also lived in constant fear, not only of foreign invaders, but of the enemies lurking within their own palace walls. The internal strife in the pharaoh's court, often involving betrayals, assassinations, and conspiracies, contributed to the weakening of Egypt's political system. As power shifted from one courtier to the next, the kingdom began to lose the centralized authority it once had under stronger rulers. This fragmentation created an atmosphere of instability, where rivals vied for control, each one attempting to leverage any advantage they could gain. The death of a pharaoh could spark chaos, particularly if there was no clear heir. Succession struggles often led to violent battles for the throne, not just between family members, but among high-ranking officials who saw an opportunity to step into the void left by a fallen leader. These power struggles destabilized Egypt's political and military strength, leaving the nation vulnerable to both internal collapse and external threats. Perhaps the most telling example of this came during the reign of Ramses III, who faced one of the most significant challenges to his rule, a conspiracy within his own harem, orchestrated by his wives and members of the royal court. This plot, known as the Harem Conspiracy, was an attempt by his wife Tai and her supporters to place her son on the throne in place of Ramses III's chosen heir. The conspirators planned to murder the pharaoh, and while their plot was ultimately discovered, it illustrated the lengths to which the courtiers were willing to go for power. Even after the conspiracy was thwarted, the damage was done. Ramses III's reign had been seriously undermined, and his authority was permanently weakened. The conspiracy's aftermath marked the beginning of the end for the 20th dynasty, as political instability became the defining feature of Egypt's leadership in the years that followed. His death left the throne to his son, who was ill-prepared to lead, and the royal family struggled to maintain control over a divided and weakened empire. This story of intrigue within the pharaoh's court reflects a much broader problem faced by the ruling elite in Egypt: the dangers of an overconcentration of power in a single individual. While the pharaoh was seen as the divine ruler, his reign was not secure if the court itself was not stable. The pharaoh's own inability to control the ambitions of those around him contributed to the downfall of his lineage and the eventual decline of Egypt's centralized power. The fall of the pharaoh's court also marked the decline of Egypt's political dominance in the region. As Egypt's internal struggles consumed its leadership, its enemies, both foreign and domestic, saw opportunities to exploit the kingdom's vulnerabilities. The once dominant empire began to lose its grip on neighboring territories, and Egypt's control over trade routes weakened. These external pressures further weakened Egypt's ability to maintain its power and prestige, leading to the eventual invasion by foreign powers like the Libyans, the Nubians, and the Assyrians. By the time Egypt entered the late period of its history, the pharaoh's court was no longer the center of political and military power it once had been. The political games that had characterized the court became less about securing Egypt's future and more about survival in the face of external and internal threats. The struggle for power within the court had transformed from a game of strategy into a desperate fight for survival. The fall of the pharaoh's court, however, did not mean the end of Egypt's civilization. Despite the internal strife and the weakening of central authority, Egypt's cultural and religious heritage continued to influence the world. The temples, the art, the literature, and the monuments that had been built during Egypt's golden age remained. Egypt may have lost its political power, but its legacy endured in the minds of future civilizations. Ultimately, the story of the pharaoh's court and its internal battles for power teaches us that the pursuit of leadership and control is fraught with danger. Political intrigue and betrayals might bring temporary success, but they can also lead to downfall. Power, when concentrated too heavily in one place, is fragile, and it can easily unravel when those who hold it are divided and distracted by their own ambitions. The price of power in ancient Egypt was high, both for the pharaoh and for the court. The ambition, betrayal, and manipulation that characterized Egypt's political landscape were the very forces that eroded the strength of the kingdom. And as Egypt's rulers sought immortality through monuments and grand tombs, it was the very fragility of power within their court that hastened the downfall of one of the world's greatest empires. Throughout Egypt's long and storied history, its rulers were not just concerned with the intrigues within their courts, but also with the external threats that came from rival kingdoms. The pharaohs, while holding absolute power within Egypt, constantly faced pressure from surrounding empires and tribes that sought to challenge Egypt's dominance. These bitter rivalries and wars with foreign kings were central to Egypt's military history and had profound effects on the empire's long-term stability. At the height of Egypt's power, during the New Kingdom, the pharaohs expanded their influence far beyond the Nile. They waged wars of conquest against powerful neighbors such as the Hittites, Nubians, and Libyans, all of whom posed threats to Egypt's hegemony in the ancient world. The pharaohs were not only military leaders, but also viewed themselves as protectors of Egypt's gods and civilization. The wars they fought were not just battles for territory. They were seen as struggles for divine legitimacy, with the pharaohs fighting to maintain the favor of the gods and to defend Egypt's place as the center of the world. One of the most famous military campaigns in Egyptian history was led by Pharaoh Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt. Thutmose III's reign marked the peak of Egypt's imperial power. He led numerous campaigns into Canaan, Syria, and Mesopotamia, decisively defeating several powerful kings, including the Mitanni and Hittite rulers. His military prowess earned him the title of Master of the Two Lands and cemented Egypt's position as the preeminent power in the ancient Near East. The Persians, who had already begun their conquest of the Near East, marched on Egypt and overthrew the ruling pharaoh, marking the first time Egypt had been conquered by a foreign power since the New Kingdom. The loss of Egypt to the Persians was not only a military defeat, but also a psychological blow. The pharaohs, who had once stood as the divine rulers of the Nile, were now subject to a foreign king. The ancient civilization, which had once withstood the test of time, was now a province within a much larger empire. Cambyses II's conquest of Egypt was swift and decisive. Though the Egyptians fought valiantly, the Persian military was far better equipped and organized. After defeating the Egyptian army at the Battle of Pelusium, Cambyses II marched into the heart of Egypt, capturing the city of Memphis and taking control of the entire country. For the first time in thousands of years, Egypt was no longer an independent kingdom. The Persian occupation of Egypt was not a brief one. Egypt remained under Persian control for nearly 2 centuries, with the Persians ruling Egypt through a series of satraps, or provincial governors. Although Egypt retained a degree of autonomy, it was no longer the powerful empire it had once been. The glory of the pharaohs was replaced by Persian bureaucracy and the presence of foreign governors. The native Egyptian rulers were reduced to symbolic figures, unable to regain the power they once held. Yet, even in the face of foreign domination, the spirit of Egypt's legacy endured. The Egyptians did not easily surrender their cultural identity, and their influence continued to be felt across the Mediterranean and Near East. Despite being controlled by foreign powers, Egypt remained a center of learning, religion, and culture. The Egyptian gods continued to be worshipped, the traditions of mummification and burial persisted, and the grand monuments of the pharaohs remained awe-inspiring symbols of Egypt's past glory. The fall of Egypt to the Persians, however, was not the final chapter in the story of Egypt's decline. In 332 BCE, a new power emerged on the horizon, the Macedonian Empire, led by Alexander the Great. Alexander, in his quest to build an empire that spanned the known world, turned his eyes on Egypt. In a remarkably swift campaign, Alexander's forces defeated the Persian satraps and liberated Egypt, marking the end of Persian rule and the beginning of a new era for Egypt. Although Alexander the Great's conquest brought a sense of freedom to Egypt, it did not restore the ancient power and prestige the pharaohs had once held. After Alexander's death, Egypt fell under the control of his generals, and the Ptolemaic dynasty was established. The Ptolemies, who were of Greek descent, ruled Egypt for several centuries, but their reign marked the end of the era of native Egyptian rulers. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt was no longer an empire in its own right, but rather a part of the larger, Hellenistic world. The once proud civilization that had ruled over vast swaths of Africa and the Middle East was now a subordinate player in the game of global politics. The story of Egypt's fall to foreign kings and empires is a tale of the cyclical nature of power. Even the greatest of civilizations, no matter how powerful or revered, are ultimately subject to the changing tides of history. The pharaohs, who once stood as the divine rulers of the Nile, were eventually overtaken by the very forces they had once sought to control. The empire that had been built on military conquest, divine authority, and cultural dominance was gradually eroded by the rise of new powers. And yet, despite the fall of Egypt, its legacy endures. The monuments, art, literature, and religious practices of ancient Egypt continue to influence the world today. The story of the pharaohs and their bitter rivalries with foreign kings serves as a reminder that the quest for power, no matter how grand, is always temporary. Empires rise and fall, but the lessons of their rise and fall, the legacy they leave behind, and the cultural contributions they make, remain. Egypt may have fallen, but its spirit lives on in the echoes of its history.